effective. We're going to look at some of the specific weapons and why they worked or why they didn't. For the individual soldier, he will have a rifle. Now, rifles are great, but if no man's land is a mile long, you can't reach your enemy. Also, these aren't terribly modern. It's essentially the same guns that were used in the War of 1812. So in that way, not very modern at all. Now, there were some snipers, specialists, but because everyone's underground, you can't use it that often. So here we see some soldiers trying to gauge where the sniper is. And the individual soldier isn't all that effective, especially if no man's land is greater than, a couple dozen yards. Also means that your bayonet isn't all that effective. Your bayonet would only be used in hand-to-hand combat. You can see a little bit on the left-hand side, these little areas of thickness. That's a hole where it will connect to the end of your rifle. I mean, to use your bayonet, you'd have to make it over the top of the trench, make it across no man's land, and get into your enemy's trench. And also, there are plenty of problems with using a bayonet. If it's dull, if I've never stabbed anyone, but I would assume that when you do stab one, it's not like Play-Doh. It's not like slicing into a cake. There's organs and bones and plenty of other issues in killing someone and then retrieving it. And then also the psychological aspect of you need to be a couple feet away from someone if you're going to use this weapon. Then we have the machine gun. We saw the Maxim gun earlier. This is even more advanced. The Maxim gun was usually hand cranked. Now this machine gun is propelled by that ricocheting action. So when the gun ricochets, that pulls the next bullet into the chamber. One problem, however, is it does take a few people to operate. You need one person strictly on the bullets to make sure everything's running smoothly. You need one person directing the location. You need at least a couple people cooling it off, making sure everything's in the right place. It's incredibly effective. It is worth 80 single rifles, but you can't move it. You can't really put it on wheels. You're not going to get it across no man's land because it's so bumpy. So it really only can be used for defensive purposes. So maybe you could try using a grenade. There's a couple ways you could propel it. You could throw it by hand, but no man's land is greater than 100 yards. You're probably not going to get it that far. So maybe you can propel it with a rifle, an RPG. Okay, that gets you a little bit further, but still, you can only cover so much space. And then in the types of grenades themselves, you could have a timed fuse. This is sort of like the grenades we think of today where you pull the pin and you throw it. Or there are grenades that will explode on impact. Again, both of these have problems. Let's say you pull the pin and you throw it, but you throw like a girl, it might blow up in your own trench. Or let's say you pull the pin, throw it too early, gets to the other side, and they throw it back, still not good. Impact bombs, maybe they don't explode on impact, or there's all sorts of problems. As the war goes on and supplies become scarce, soldiers do start to make their own sort of flying bombs. This is like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. They take tin cans left over from their food, fill it with projectiles, with gunpowder and a fuse, and they're going to do whatever they can to try and defeat their enemy. One very prevalent weapon that we remember from this war is gas attacks. And chemical warfare is not new. It's been available for centuries, but it was rarely used. It was seen as going against the rules of war, sort of this gentlemanly conduct that generals followed. The French were the first to try it, but the Germans perfect it because they do have superior technology. The thing about chemical weapons, especially gas attacks, is in the trenches, you're not taking territory. The individual soldier's rifle is useless. You are going to try whatever you need to hurt the enemy. So there's different types of gases that are used. First, there's tear gas, still used today. It's just sort of discomforting. But it bothers your eyes, but not really all that damaging. So then there's chlorine gas. Chlorine gas, when it is inhaled, can cause asphyxiation and sort of burns your lungs and kills you from the inside out. Then there is phogene, Phosgene. Phogene gas, it does have a smell, so you can sort of detect it beforehand. Smells like moldy grass, but also you're in the middle of a field, so is it moldy grass or is it this gas attack? Again, similar to chlorine, it would cause asphyxiation, but in the case of phogene, it might take up to 48 hours. So you wouldn't know if you were attacked or not if you didn't smell the gas. And then probably the most damaging would be mustard gas. This not only can damage your lungs, it can essentially boil your lungs, but it will cause these awful blisters on any exposed skin. Might not kill you right away, but you might die from your injuries. Different methods of gas attack. You can have a grenade sort of thing. You can put it into artillery, or you can also just sort of connect it to tanks, and if it's a nice breeze and the wind is in your favor, it can float across to the other side. Another type of weapon are flamethrowers. Not new, just like chemical weapons. If you have some sort of fuel source and you have flame, you can have a flamethrower. First time this was used in World War I is 1915. Again, we're starting to use crazier techniques because trench warfare, we've gotten to that stalemate. We're going to try whatever we can to have something change. You really need to be close to your enemy in order to use this, so that's one setback. And also, it's very dangerous to operate. You're essentially carrying a backpack of gasoline. If you're shot, you are blowing up. And there's a great clip from The Young Indiana Jones, if you want to watch that shows both gas attack and flamethrowers. And this, in 1916, is when we will see tanks, finally. Now, the idea of an armored vehicle is not new. Leonardo da Vinci came up with ideas. They tried them in the 1700s, sort of these protected carriages. But they all failed, and there are two reasons why. One, these new tanks have caterpillar tracks. They can be pulled by tractors. This is important, especially with trenches, because wheels would fall into the trenches, or wheels would get stuck in no man's land. With caterpillar tracks, the tanks will be able to go over the top of the trenches to deal with the inconsistencies in the terrain. Also, they're made with stronger metal, so they can withstand more. And they are self-propelled. Think of our discussion during the Industrial Revolution, where the steam engine starts with needing to be fed by coal all the time. But once we get gas-related fuels that can be self-contained, then they can run on their own. Winston Churchill was really pushing for use of the tanks because he wanted to see some sort of change. Once stalemate sets in, you need to come up with new things. You need to come up with new techniques. And Churchill was very important in getting the tanks used starting in 1916. But then, once the tanks start being used, they create weapons to defend against the tanks, and that's why you have landmines, pressure-triggered bombs that are buried underground. Problem with that is you don't always remember where you buried your landmine, so you could potentially be damaged by your own weapons. And then the most effective weapons of this war were the artillery, the big guns, the big cannons. Now, mortars, they were smaller caliber, maybe a few inches. Caliber refers to the size of the bombs. Then we have the howitzers. Howitzers were even used in the Civil War in America, but now they're being made with stronger materials, more effective bombs. But the biggest and most effective were the Big Berthas, or Grosse Bertha, created by the Germans. And you can see the little ladders here. That's how large they are. Those were ladders for soldiers to climb up and operate Big Bertha. Big Bertha's shells were almost 17 inches in diameter, and she had a range of over 7 miles. So this is the type of shelling that could go on for days on end. Now, those shells don't always explode the way they're supposed to, so there are still some left across France. Not everywhere, but scattered here and there. Sometimes they're found by a farmer who's plowing his land, and bomb disposal has to be called in to make sure that they're not live. But this is where Moonscape comes from. Finally, in the air, we're going to start seeing the emergence of an air force, first with observation balloons. And this is essentially a hot air balloon on a tether. So you've got a big basket, and a guy goes up in the air, a couple guys with binoculars, and this is used for reconnaissance, getting information about the enemy, seeing, troop movements a few miles away, seeing if new trenches have been built. And then they can come back down, because hot air balloons cannot direct where they go. They are completely reliant on the wind. That's why Zeppelins become so popular. You see the picture of the Zeppelin there. It's an early type of blimp. It can be propelled, it can be steered. So in this case, the Navy will be using Zeppelins because they can go over water, they can go over the ocean and try and see where some of these U-boats are. They're not going terribly deep underwater, so sometimes the pilots in the Zeppelins were able to see where the U-boats were and then give that intelligence back to the Navy. Army is also using it, again, where the trench is being rebuilt, where are the troops, how can we use this to our advantage. There are a few cases, however, of Zeppelins being used for offensive purposes, dropping bombs, one in Paris and one over London. But really, when we think of Air Force, we think of planes. And this is the first war when planes are used, because it's really only been a decade since the Wright brothers had their historic first flight. The planes really do sort of replace the cavalry, the horses. Because if you think of cavalry in old-fashioned warfare, they would rush in. They would, kill some people, but they would get information and they would rush out. So now planes are taking that place, because as you'll see if you watch War Horse, the cavalry isn't very effective in terms of trench warfare. So again, it's about getting information, getting reconnaissance, and then eventually they will start using planes for offensive purposes. They will load machine guns. You can see here on this photograph, machine guns on these planes. At first, they experience a few difficulties, accidentally shooting off their propellers. So pretty quickly, they realize that they have to sync the pattern of the bullets with the rhythm of the propeller. As both sides start using this technology, we develop fighter pilots. Probably the most famous is the Red Baron from Germany. This is Baron Manfred von Richthofen. He was a young, noble German. He learned to fly these planes. He had more kills than any other pilot, shoots down more Allied planes than anyone else, and he becomes a bit of a celebrity. There's sort of this glamour to this new technology, this new warfare. And he eventually is killed in battle in 1918.